In the name of the one true God, who is known to us as Creator, Redeemer, and Sanctifier of the world. Amen. Please be seated. This morning's readings are very hard for us to hear. A reading from Lamentations, the book aptly named, for it is one of lament. Psalm 137, in all its confronting grief and anger. From the second letter to Timothy, an encouragement to Timothy, yes, but with an edge of Paul's own suffering and pain in there. And there's almost a sense of fear for Timothy in this impassioned encouragement. And lastly, our gospel passage, which talks about faith the size of a mustard seed, but then also talks about us being worthless slaves. It's easy to think that I might preach on the collect, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I want us to look at Psalm 137, because importantly, the compilers of our reading sheet have included the last two verses, which the lectionary tells us we can omit. The last two verses are the most disturbing verses for us in this psalm. They speak of an anger and a hatred and a grief and a despair that finds its voice in fantasized violence. For that reason, often these verses are omitted because we don't want to face that. But if we're really honest, it is part of our human frailty. We know how angry we can become at times. And we see conflict throughout the world brought about by these fantasies of violence being made real through the actions of those who use empire as a tool for oppression. So let's look at the psalm a bit more closely. By the waters of Babylon, we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. This is written in captivity. If you're of a certain age, you've probably got a Boney M soundtrack running through your mind at the moment. I won't sing it, but I did put the link in my pastoral this week. That song is repressibly upbeat, but tellingly sung by African American singers who themselves bear a story of slavery and captivity and oppression in their very DNA. For African American scholars, this psalm is a psalm which speaks deeply into their experience of being people who were carried away into captivity, carried to a new Babylon, carried away from their Zion. As for our harps, we hung them up upon the trees that were in the land. We cannot even make music in this place. Such is the depth of our grief and despair. There is no joy in us. And beyond no joy in us, we can't even sing a song of lament. We are in a place where we are beyond raising our voices. For there those who led us away captive required of us a song, and those who had despoiled us demanded mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." Their heritage, their songs, songs which are songs of worship and praise, are being treated as chattels, as trivialities, as something to make merry to. There is no respect in this. There is no understanding of what these songs are. The Psalms themselves, songs of worship and praise, they're not to be sung for party making. They're not to be sung as entertainment. But here we are, their captors are demanding that they take sacred texts and debase them by using them for entertainment. Verse 4. How can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? Verse 4 is unique in the Psalms. Usually when we read our psalm verses, there is a pattern. One of the ways we can say it, we say it by alternate verses here at 8 o'clock. Another way of saying it is we read to the colon and then we respond with the words after the colon. Verse 4 shatters that system. Verse 4 shows the utter desolation in this psalm because it can't even meet the rhythm, the structure of the psalm. So broken are these people that they can't even sing, form a psalm in the way that psalms should be formed. So utter is their despair that we hear this cry, how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? And there is no response. For me, this verse is the one that breaks my heart, because it tells of an utter feeling of being bereft. When we can no longer form the words that sing our worship to God, when we feel so cut off, so alien, so distant, it is this verse that reminds me of that place of utter despair. We hear this cry in the Psalms, and this is why the Psalms are so important for us in our scriptures, because whilst we hear songs of praise and songs of worship and songs of comfort, we also hear this psalm which identifies with us in our lowest points. And so on verse 4 we turn. There's no longer we. We sat down and wept. We hung them up. Required of us a song. After verse 4 it becomes personal. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its mastery. Let me forget how to do, how to be. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you. Let me be struck dumb. Let me no longer be able to speak, much less sing, if I do not prefer Jerusalem, the place where God dwells, above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites the day of Jerusalem, how they said, down with it, raise it to its foundations. And then these final two verses, which are so often omitted. O daughter of Babylon, you that lay waste, happy shall he be who serves you as you have served us. Happy shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the stones. They are deeply disturbing and uncomfortable verses to read. And yet, as I said, we know that it is the capability of fragile, frail humanity to enact such fantasies of violence. We see it. Tragically, we see it still now. This is not a violence trapped in ancient times, but a violence that continues now. We see it in Afghanistan, we see it in Iraq, we see it in Ukraine. We see it in places throughout the world, in Africa, where the media cannot penetrate, and so we do not hear their voices. This oppression, this fantasized violence, comes out of a place of deep anger. And as I said earlier, African American scholars particularly see this psalm as something that relates to their own experience of being carried away into captivity. But the lesson the scholars take from this is that we have another way. We must not fall into the temptation of this enacted violence, but instead seek, like Martin Luther King, a different way. A way in which that anger, that despair, that lament against the injustice and the utter bereftness is channeled into stones that are not used for violence, but instead, like Jesus says as he is entering Jerusalem, stones that will cry out themselves. Where will our cry be heard? Where will we cry out against the systems of oppression and captivity and injustice? When we think more widely, there are many groups within our community who can find an identity within the words of the psalm. And my thoughts immediately went to our First Nations peoples who have suffered captivity within their own land, whose sacred texts have been turned into entertainment and have lived with oppression. I found this midrash of Psalm 137 by Carl Hand. And as I conclude with it today, I invite you, indeed encourage us, to think about how we can lend our voice, raise our voices, like stones that cry out for our First Nations peoples. By the waterholes of Mother Country, we slung down our yidakis and cut our bodies and drugged our minds in grief as we remembered the Dreamtime. And the settlers demanded from us a corroboree performance and a jail sentence, mutual obligation and a souvenir boomerang for the gift shop. How could we dance and perform sacred traditions for their markets? We have become aliens and inmates, invisible in this eternal land. If I forget the traditions of the elders, then will the brightly coloured birds fade to grey. Then will the rainbow serpent permit the sun to dry up all the waterholes, and droughts and floods will come. By Amy, we'll remember those white settlers. Invaders, we'll bless those who pay you back for smallpox and the hangman's noose. And you, daughters of the British Empire, ravagers will be destroyed, for you stole our children and you smashed their heritage against the jagged reefs. Will we stand with the oppressors or with the oppressed? Amen.